it's Nicole. One of you suggested a bookshelf tour a while back. I hope this counts. I'm going to show you all my Black Spine Penguin classics today. Some I have read, some I haven't. The bookcases behind me store my read books. I have another bookcase, slightly smaller than this, thankfully, that houses my unread books. I'll do the English classics from the latest to the earliest in terms of time period, and I will do classics from around the world at the end. From the 20th century, I have two E.M. Forster. Where Angels Fear to Tread is the only novel by him I've read so far. I know it's not his most famous novel, so why did I end up there? When I first set off reading English classics, I was a perfectionist and a bit of all or nothing kind of girl. If I decided to read an author, I'd aim to start from his first and read all the way to his last. That's why the first play I read by Shakespeare was Henry VI Part 2, and the first novel I read by Forster was Where Angels Fear to Tread. And it's still the only novel I've read by Forster. I wish I'd read Howards End or A Room with a View. I'm a bit better now. I can now go with the most famous book by a certain author and just leave it there. For the story itself, I read it in 2021. I always write the dates down. I can't remember at all what it's about except for some snapshots of scenes. I checked its plot summary on the Wikipedia page and still didn't recognize it. Oops. The other one by Forster is Aspects of the Novel. I haven't read this one. It's a non-fiction book on his analysis of the literary form of the novel. The blurb at the back sounds fabulous. I must get to this soon. By the way, I love this cover photo of Forster deep in thought. I imagine him writing. I don't think he is writing. If you look closely, the page has printed text on it, but imagine he's writing. It looks like a writer deep in thought, right? But it's a cropped image. If you look at the whole picture, there's another guy in the background. The first thing that came to my mind was that this is an editor chasing Forster for a piece of writing, and he will not leave until Forster finishes. That changes the feeling of this picture completely. Forster is not deep in thought anymore. He's deep in trouble and he's having a headache. Another one from the early 20th century is A Shepherd's Life by W.H. Hudson. I heard about it from The Shepherd's Life by James Rebanks, which is one of my favorite books of all time. This is about the author's own shepherd's life in the Lake District now. Hudson is not a shepherd himself. He talks to a shepherd and other ordinary men and women of the land from a different part of England and writes their story in this book. Now I read some of John Clare's poems, I'd quite like to know what W.H. Hudson would have thought about Clare. I feel like they could have been friends because they write about rural life in a similar nostalgic tone. Travel back in time to the Victorian era, I have selected poems by Tennyson and The Complete Nonsense and Other Verse by Edward Lear. Tennyson was the poet laureate during much of Queen Victoria's reign. The British Poet Laureate is an honorary position appointed by the monarch. They are expected to write verses for significant national occasions. The current laureate is Simon Armitage. I wonder what he wrote for the late Queen or the coronation of Charles III. I just learned this. The origins of the laureateship date back to 1616 when a pension was provided to Ben Jonson, and the first official holder of the position was John Dryden, appointed in 1668 by Charles II. On the death of Tennyson, I didn't know this either, there was a break of 4 years as a mark of respect. People must have really loved him. Edward Lear lived at the same time as Tennyson. He was an English artist, illustrator, musician, author, and poet. He even did a few illustrations for Tennyson's poems. He's probably most famous now for writing The Owl and the Pussycat. Last time I read it on my channel, a lot of you commented how you brought back many memories, either of yourself or your children reciting it. Let's go further back in time to the early 19th century. I have two novels by Jane Austen, Emma and Persuasion. Persuasion is my favorite Jane Austen novel. C.S. Lewis calls it something like the only love story by Jane Austen, which is very interesting. I don't like this cover. It's also a second-hand copy and not in very good condition. I kind of taped it up. I might get a pretty edition at some point. Emma Woodhouse, what a lucky girl. And one thing that always pops into my mind every time Emma is mentioned is the fact that Mr. Knightley, the man she marries in the end, is 17 years older than her. 17 years. Tales from Shakespeare was published a few years earlier than those. Charles and Mary Lamb wrote the retellings of Shakespeare's comedies and tragedies for young readers, especially girls. I got this at the beginning of my Shakespeare journey. I have to say, I'm not a big fan, although I love Charles and Mary Lamb as people. Their intention, as it is written in the preface, is that because girls in the early 19th century don't have access to their father's library as much as their brothers do, so with this book they can find out what the plays are about. And when their brothers read them, some lines from the original, the girls would know the context. In that sense, it does an excellent job, but the beauty and glory of Shakespeare's plays is in the speeches and the language, the words themselves. The plot summary often makes them sound quite ridiculous. These retellings did help me get familiar with the storyline of the plays, but they did not make me love Shakespeare more. So, approach with caution. I also have a collection of Charles Lamb's essays. It's called Selected Prose. I heard so much about him. He sacrificed a lot for his family, especially his sister. But I don't get the impression he's bitter. He sounds like a witty and funny guy. I read you a letter from him to John Clare in a previous video. He talks about eating frogs. There's an essay in this titled A Dissertation Upon Roast Pig. I'd love to make better acquaintances, Mr. Lamb. From the late 18th century, I have this. It's a collection of stories by Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother, and Mary Shelley, the daughter. I read Mary by Mary Wollstonecraft. I don't remember much except that it's about an unhappy marriage, and the very last line left a deep impression. It says, in moments of solitary sadness, so Mary was dying at this point, a gleam of joy would dart across her mind. She thought she was hastening to that world where there is neither marrying nor giving in marriage. That's a quote from the Bible. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. I have never thought of that verse in the context of an unhappy marriage before. It's very interesting. From the middle of the 18th century, I have The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia by Samuel Johnson. I haven't read this one. The blurb sounds like an allegory. Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, feels trapped by his trouble-free life in the Happy Valley, a place of peace and luxury. When he encounters the much-traveled philosopher Imlac, he decides they should escape through the mountains to the country beyond, where he can experience the full range of human emotions. Joined by his sister and her attendant, they journey to Egypt, where they search for the true meaning of happiness by studying the lives of the people they meet. wryly exploring the human condition and mankind's stoical capacity for hope. The history of Rasselas questions whether it is possible for man to make a choice to ensure lasting happiness, the choice of life. From a couple of decades before that, I have two novels by Daniel Defoe. A Journal of the Plague Year was one of the most fascinating books I read. I read it in March 2022. I think the world had just come out of COVID and lockdown, or was towards the end of it at that point. It's a fictional book about the Great Plague in London in 1665, but it reads like a non-fictional account, like a personal journal. It uses first-person narration. He talks about how he decides to stay in the city, about what he sees and hears every day. He gives precise stats of death in each parish, in the city over each month. It's interesting to see they come to pretty much the same conclusion about quarantine as we did. And that word, quarantine, which sounds so 2020 to me, is the exact word he uses in the book. I'll read you a paragraph where he praises how the government officials managed the devastating situation, just for some perspective. He says, but the magistrates cannot be enough commended in this, that they kept such good order for the burying of the dead, that as fast as any of those they employed to carry off and bury the dead fell sick or died, as was many times the case, they immediately supplied the places with others, which by reason of the great number of poor that was left out of business, as above, was not hard to do. This occasioned that notwithstanding the infinite number of people which died and were sick almost altogether, yet they were always cleared away and carried off every night, so that it was never to be said of London that the living were not able to bury the dead. And he concludes with this: a dreadful plague in London was in the year 65, which swept 100,000 souls away, yet I alive. If your heart is strong enough, this is a fascinating read. The same year, Defoe also published More Flanders. The novel provides its own plot summary on the title page. I'll read it for you. The fortunes and misfortunes of the famous More Flanders, etc., who was born in Newgate, and during a life of continued variety for 60 years, besides her childhood, was 12 year a whore, 5 times a wife, bracket, whereof once to her own brother, 12 year a thief, 8 year a transported felon in Virginia, at last grew rich, lived honest, and died a penitent. Woohoo! We're now in the 17th century. This was published in 1666, just 1 year after the Great Plague of London, which is heard about in Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. This is The Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish, but that's not 1/10 as impressive as its original title page, which says, the description of a new world called The Blazing World, written by the thrice noble, illustrious, and excellent Princess the Duchess of Newcastle. I love it. It's about a young woman who enters another universe by accident. The emperor of this universe immediately marries her and gives her the absolute power to rule the place. The Blazing World is described by the Norton Anthology as part romance, part utopia, and part science fiction. What I like best is in the preface, she writes, though I cannot be Henry V or Charles II, yet I endeavour to be Margaret I. And although I have neither power, time, nor occasion to conquer the world as Alexander and Caesar did, yet rather than not to be mistress of one, since fortune and the fates would give me none, I have made a world of my own. I love it. I love it. The Canterbury Tales by Chaucer was written towards the end of 14th century. This is one of my goals this year. It's so famous it hardly needs an introduction. It's a collection of 24 stories written originally in Middle English, mostly in verse. This is a verse translation. A group of pilgrims decides to tell stories as a competition and to kill time, presumably, as they travel together from London to Canterbury. That's all of my English classics, so 5 from the world, different parts of the world. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, a very well-known novel. I loved how Tolstoy writes about the irresistible attraction. This might be a weird comparison. Some scenes give me a Jane Austen feel, but obviously Tolstoy is stronger and darker. Oh, this is going to topple. Madame Bovary by Flaubert. I read this a while ago and I can't quite remember the plot. I made a dedicated video about her, if you're interested. I also remember that I wanted to make a video comparing her and Becky Sharp in Vanity Fair. So Madame Bovary is probably one of those scheming women, but I can't remember very well. Ooh. City of God by Augustine. It belongs to my husband. It's just here to make the pile bigger. I'm pretty sure it's Christian theology. The blurb says, "The heavenly city outshines Rome beyond comparison. There, instead of victory, is truth. Instead of high rank, holiness." I don't know much about this. The Theban Place by Sophocles. Sophocles was an ancient Greek tragedian. He wrote over 120 plays, but only 7 have survived in a complete form. The Theban Plays are a group of 3 plays about the fate of Thebes during and after the reign of King Oedipus. They are not a proper trilogy. They are often published together like this, but Sophocles wrote them separately years apart. I haven't read this one, would like to very much. Last one, Homer's Iliad. I was intimidated at the beginning, but to my surprise, I had enormous fun reading the Iliad. I made a playlist with 4 or 5 videos analyzing a few characters that stood out to me. If you are intimidated too, maybe give it a go. It's great fun. That's all the Penguin Black Spine I have. What would you like to see next? Let me know in the comments. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.